In today's video, I'll be taking you through my updated 2024 presidential election prediction between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. I'll be filling in this Electoral College Map to see how the race to the White House stands as of right now. Now, first of all, let's take a look at the national polling. Currently speaking, Kamala Harris does enjoy a 3.2% advantage over Donald Trump. She's at 47% to Donald Trump, who is at 44%. Now, do keep in mind that she did have a slightly bigger lead a couple of weeks ago, around August 28th, and Joe Biden did hold about an 8% lead in polling in 2020, when he only won the national popular vote by 4.5% and won the Electoral College by even narrower margin. Nevertheless, here the polling right now does suggest that it will probably be a pretty competitive race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. With that all in mind, let's fill in the Electoral College map. So first off, for Kamala Harris's safe states, these are all states that will go for Kamala Harris by a safe margin. Now these are particularly surprising because they all voted for Joe Biden by at least 15% back in the 2020 general election. That does bring Kamala Harris up to 167 Electoral College votes. Donald Trump will obviously also have his safe states, and he does have a relatively smaller share of those safe states here, and he's going to only end up around 125 Electoral College votes from these safe states. So as you can see, Kamala Harris does have an early lead, but Donald Trump is going to catch up in some of the likely states here. Now let's go to Donald Trump's likely states. First off, let's go to Iowa and Ohio. These are pretty obvious states for Donald Trump. Back in 2020, these states were consistently considered competitive in the polling. Donald Trump had only pretty minimal leads in both states, in Ohio by 0.8%, and in Iowa by 1.3%. In fact, Joe Biden had held marginal leads in both of these states a few weeks before the presidential election, before Donald Trump ended up taking the leads in the more recent polls leading up to the election, and won both these states by about 8% in the presidential race. Now, both of these states do have some similarities, where Joe Biden only won a few counties in both of these states, while Donald Trump swept the rest. In Iowa, Joe Biden won all but 6 relatively urban counties, and in Ohio, again, Joe Biden lost all but 7 of the counties in the state of Ohio. Both these states are not really in play in 2024, and of course, they're likely Republican. Another state that will probably be likely Republican is the state of Florida. That is not very surprising. This was a state that voted for Donald Trump by a surprisingly large margin in 2020, 3.3%. A lot of Democratic strategists were sweating when this occurred because the state of Florida was definitely considered in play for both sides, if not tilting slightly towards Joe Biden at the end of the campaign season. You can see that Donald Trump significantly overperformed in a lot of these more Hispanic areas, specifically Miami-Dade County, where there's a very predominant Cuban population, and which trended about 22 points towards Joe Biden over Donald Trump in the state. So of course, the state of Florida right now going to go likely towards the Republican column here. Now moving on here to the state of Texas. Texas is of course an electoral giant in terms of its politics, holding 40 Electoral College votes, or roughly 7% of the entire Electoral College votes in the United States. Now Texas in recent years have trended more Democratic, as many of these Sunbelt states have, but in particular in Texas, where we saw massive shifts in favor of Joe Biden in some of the suburbs, for example, Dallas County, a more urban area, or if you go around it, Collins County, Denton County, as well as Tarrant County. These are very densely populated counties. These 4 counties make up roughly 3 million total votes of Texas's around 11 million votes back in 2020, or about 25% of the population live in these 4 counties alone. However, Republicans have also seen significant improvements in some of the more rural parts of the state, for example up here, as well as the Rio Grande Valley, which is the more Hispanic part of the state, which is down here. You see that these are more sparsely populated counties, for example Starr County, right? This is a county home to only about 18,000 voters. But nevertheless here, if we look at some of these trends here, they're truly significant in favor of Donald Trump. We're talking about 55% in Starr County, 38% in Zapata County, or something along those lines, which are really big. And in 2024, I just simply do not believe that Donald Trump will be able to end up actually losing the state to Kamala Harris, just because of the national environment, as well as some of the major Hispanic improvements that Donald Trump made in the 2020 election, and will most likely continue to make in 2024. So the state of Texas right now is in the likely Republican column. Now that essentially wraps it up here for the likely Trump states, which does bring Donald Trump up to 218 Electoral College votes, 51 ahead of Kamala Harris. Now let's give Harris's her likely states. Now Colorado and New Mexico doesn't really require much of an explanation, and so does the state of New Jersey. These are obvious likely Kamala Harris states, and I'm going to add one more addition to this list, being the state of Minnesota. We know that Tim Walz is the governor of Minnesota, and generally the VP selection does give you a boost. Additionally, Democrats have done pretty well in some of the Minneapolis suburbs here, around Minneapolis and Anoka County, Washington County, Dakota County. Of course, Republicans have been doing quite well in the rural areas and have been making pretty major improvements in some of the more rural areas, which are traditionally more Democratic. Nevertheless, here the state of Minnesota here will be in the likely blue column. Now I'm just going to be going these states in around geographical order. I'm going to start off here with the state of Nevada. Now, Nevada is a state that voted for Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton back in 2016 and 2020 respectively by around a margin of 2.4%. However, if you look at some of the trends in the state of Nevada, you can see something that is abundantly clear. Clark County, the largest county by state in terms of population, which encompasses roughly 2/3 of the entire electorate in the state of Nevada, has been heavily trending towards the Republican Party. Now, back in 2016, this was a double-digit county for Hillary Clinton. In 2020, this was about a 9-point win for Joe Biden. Now, in 2022, this was roughly a 6% win for incumbent Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, and about a 4% win for incumbent Democratic Governor at the time, Steve Sisolak. This is again a huge population center where the state's elections are essentially decided. Additionally, Republicans have been doing pretty well in the rural areas, driving up a lot of that turnout in areas like Nye County and some of these more Republican areas, which are sparsely populated, but nevertheless overwhelmingly Republican. Now, according to polling right now, Kamala Harris does have about a 0.7% lead, but that is very minimal and far within the margin of error. At this point, I'm going to give the state of Nevada here to the Republican Party by roughly a 2% margin, or about a lean characterization. Now going to the state of Arizona. Now right now, according to polling in Arizona, this is a pretty competitive race, but Donald Trump still maintains a lead. That is quite different from the 2020 story, where Joe Biden consistently held a lead over Donald Trump in polling across the state of Arizona back then. Right now, polling is certainly more competitive, but it shows that Donald Trump is tied or slightly ahead in some of the more recent polling. Now, by contrast, the trends in the state of Arizona does favor Democrats. For example, in Maricopa County as well as Pima County, two counties that combine for roughly 75% of the population in the state, Joe Biden did about 5% better than Hillary Clinton in both of these counties. Republicans have seen some type of marginal gains in the more rural areas, but they're far more sparse in their population. For example, Graham County is only about 15,000 votes, while if you go to Maricopa County, it's about 2 million. Now, the problem here for Kamala Harris could be the fact that she's someone who is more progressive, more to the left than someone like Joe Biden. And again, there's a very moderate population in Maricopa County around the Phoenix suburbs, and that could be a problem for Kamala Harris. As well as that, if you look at polling still, polling generally underestimates Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and right now Trump is ahead by 0.3%, suggesting that he'll probably end up winning the state of Arizona here, so Arizona does still go in the total Republican column, though it is definitely a close race. Now we go to the state of Georgia. Georgia is a state that voted for Joe Biden by 11,000 votes back in 2020. This is a very competitive race for sure. Again, this is a similar story to the state of Arizona, where Joe Biden was able to do very well in where the population was, essentially in the Atlanta suburbs. For example, Gwinnett County, which is very vote-rich, produced over 400,000 votes back in 2020. This was a county that shifted 12% more Democratic than 2016. Or take even some of these more Republican counties, for example, Paulding County. This is a heavily conservative county, but it trended 12% towards Joe Biden because it is more suburban, and these counties generally do trend blue. For instance, take Forsyth County. This was a county that voted for Donald Trump here by about a 2-to-1 margin. You might say that's pretty impressive, But the fact was, Romney got about 78% of the vote here in 2012 in this exact same state with the same electorate. So you can see that Democrats have been making some improvements. By contrast, though, you do see that Republicans have been making their own improvements in the rural areas. For example, you see downstate here, there was a lot of Republican trends, despite the fact that the state heavily moved toward the Democratic Party back in 2020. And there's an additional factor for Kamala Harris to consider. Although she is definitely doing better than Joe Biden with the minority vote in around Atlanta with the black voters and Hispanic voters, she is still not meeting 2020 Biden numbers where he actually got. Biden got around 92% of the vote with black voters across the nation. Biden was polling at like 75% with black voters, and although someone like Kamala Harris is up to about 82%, that is still nowhere close to 92% where Joe Biden was at back in 2020. And considering that she herself is of a racial minority, that could certainly be a problem because she might be less appealing to many of these white suburbanites. Now, in the state of Georgia, the polling has certainly been very tight, and polling in the state has historically been quite accurate, missing by about 2% in favor of either Democrats or Republicans across the state. The problem here is that, again, this is way too close to call, and that the margin of error in some of these polls is roughly 4%. If you look at that and the fact that Trump historically gets underestimated in polling, you can still expect Trump here to win the state of Georgia here, in my opinion, by roughly a lean margin. That will be roughly 2%, similar to the state of Nevada, though the two states have pretty much dynamically opposite shifts in terms of who they're favoring in their future. Now going to the state of North Carolina. North Carolina currently, if you look at polling here, so for North Carolina, you do see that Donald Trump is still slightly favored against Kamala Harris. Now, that's a pretty different story from 2020, where Joe Biden was consistently leading in North Carolina polling by roughly 2 to 3% across the election year. Now, in 2024, Kamala Harris has pretty much never led in polling, and the fact is, again, polling does underestimate Donald Trump and the Republicans, at least in presidential years, such as 2016 and 2020. Additionally, if you look at North Carolina, this was not a state that Joe Biden was able to win. And Biden already did pretty well in some of the suburban areas. For example, he lost Carabosse County by only single digits, while Romney won the county by like 20-something points. If you look at Wake County, again, this was a county that voted for Mitt Romney by about 14%. And Donald Trump essentially lost the county to Joe Biden by almost 28%. And even then, Joe Biden was not able to win the state. That is because of the fact that Republicans made pretty substantial improvements in some of the more rural black communities, as well as some of the rural communities down here. It's going to be really difficult for Kamala Harris to win a state that Joe Biden didn't win, because it's almost a consensus that she is on defense in this election, and that Donald Trump is the sole candidate on offense. So right now, North Carolina will be a likely Republican state. Now going to the state of Virginia. Virginia was a state that voted for Biden by 10%, and at face value, this shouldn't be competitive because the state is also trending towards the Democratic Party. However, some more recent polling does suggest that this race is more competitive than people may initially believe, because if you look at Virginia right now in their polling, we don't have a polling aggregate, but Harris has not led by more than 3% in the vast majority of polls. That is a warning sign here for Kamala Harris, because again, this is about a 10% victory here for Joe Biden back in 2020. Additionally, that could show that her appeal in some of these suburban areas is simply not close to the level that Joe Biden had across the state. Now, I still expect someone like Kamala Harris to be able to win, just because the state does have a more Democratic heritage, at least in more recent years. And I just don't believe that Donald Trump is the most appealing candidate for many of these suburbanite voters around Alexandria, as well as Virginia Beach. That being said, she's definitely going to do a lot worse than Joe Biden did in the state of Virginia. Right now, I'm going to give the state to Kamala Harris here by about 3%, which is a lean characterization. Pretty interesting enough, but the state of Virginia is more competitive on this map than the state of Minnesota. Now, I'm just going to get the 2nd District of Maine out of the way. This is likely Republican, not much of a surprise. I'm also going to get Maine out of the way. This is probably going to be lean Democrat. I know at one point in time the state was actually considered a toss-up by me, but now I have moved it to the more lean Democratic characterization after some more recent polls suggest that this race is not as competitive as what I thought about a month ago. Now, that does bring Kamala Harris up to 221 Electoral College votes, but Donald Trump is at 268. He is closing in on 270. Now we go to Nebraska second, where again it's more difficult to explain, but this is a more urban district around Omaha, Nebraska. This has been a heavily trending blue area. For example, Douglas County, where Omaha is located, trended about 9% more toward the Democratic Party in 2020 than 2016. I believe Hillary Clinton got like 48% of the vote in this county, and Joe Biden got 54%. And again, this just because of geopolitics, it's going to be difficult for Donald Trump to make up that deficit. As a result, here, Nebraska's 2nd congressional district will remain in the Democratic column here by a lean margin. Now we're going to go to the state of New Hampshire. Now, in the state of New Hampshire, this is a more rural state, which makes it more difficult to poll. Nevertheless, here in the most recent polls in the polling aggregate on FiveThirtyEight, which has been released for just around a week, you can see that Kamala Harris is up by roughly 7% in the polling aggregate, with about a 4% margin of error. Now, the reason that Kamala Harris is probably going to win the state is that state has a pretty large white college-educated population, which really moved away from Donald Trump back into 2020 general election. Now, of course, I do believe that some of these counties will trend towards the Republican Party, just because that Kamala Harris does not have that level of appeal that Joe Biden did in some of these groups of voters, especially with some of these college-graduated voters, especially with like white college-graduated men. That could be an age group and demographic group where Kamala Harris does struggle a little bit. Nevertheless, here I do still have the state of New Hampshire right now going to Kamala Harris by around a lean margin, especially because New Hampshire has been trending towards the Democratic Party over the past 2 decades or so. Now, that does leave the states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in play, with Donald Trump at 268 Electoral College votes, while Kamala Harris at 226. We're going to start off here with the state of Wisconsin. Now, in the state of Wisconsin right now in polling, it does suggest that Kamala Harris is up by 3.5%, which is pretty comparable to where it was a few weeks ago. Now, a 3.5% lead for Kamala Harris may seem impressive, but do keep in mind that in 2020, Joe Biden held a 8.4% lead over Donald Trump in Wisconsin just to win the state by a fraction of 1% on election day. So as you can see, polling in the state of Wisconsin has historically not been super accurate. 2020 wasn't the first time that the state was outside the margin of error. In fact, Wisconsin polling is generally quite off, not just with Donald Trump, in particularly with him, but also generally with these statewide elections. As you can see, the Wisconsin polling, there's not much to take away from this. About 8% margin of victory here for Joe Biden, as well as the 3.5% lead for Kamala Harris. Additionally, the state does present several challenges for Kamala Harris. Firstly, if you look at the state of Wisconsin here, there are really 2 challenges that essentially Kamala Harris will have to overcome in order to win the state. The first one is the wild counties. Now, Joe Biden did pretty well in the wild counties, especially Waukesha County, where this is a traditionally more Republican area that moved away from Donald Trump, especially the more competitive areas around Milwaukee. These type of suburban, exurban areas that are about a 30-minute drive out from Milwaukee. But if you look at some of the other areas as well, in the wild counties, you look at Washington County, you look at Ozaukee County. These 3 counties essentially lost Donald Trump roughly 30,000 votes, and considering that he only lost the state by around 20,000 votes, you can see how essential the wild counties are to the Republican coalition. And essentially, if Donald Trump is able to make up these numbers so that he wins these counties by 2016 margins, he's almost guaranteed to win the state. And someone like Kamala Harris is probably not going to do as well with those white, like working class or more white affluent type of voters in some of the wild counties. Additionally, a larger problem here for Kamala Harris and Democrats in general is that Democrats are losing support with white working class voters, especially in an area like Ron Kind's former district. This area previously was heavily Democratic, now it's heavily leaning towards the Republican Party, just like the remaining parts of the rural parts of the state. For example, you look at Vernon County, right? This was a county that voted for Obama by like 20 points, and this was also a county that voted for Donald Trump by 5% just about 12 years later. And what you're seeing is that someone like Kamala Harris will probably do far worse than Joe Biden with white working class voters, because Biden really had a pretty good overreach for a Democrat in an area like this, and you're just not going to see someone like Kamala Harris with that same ability to mobilize these type of Democrats. Even Joe Biden lost some of these counties by pretty surprisingly large margins, and Kamala Harris will certainly struggle a bit. So Wisconsin right now does go into the lean Republican column, and with that, Donald Trump is elected president. Now, next up, going to the state of Michigan. Now, unlike the state of Wisconsin, where the margin in 2020 was extremely tight, in the state of Michigan, Democrats do have a buffer where they can afford to lose a little bit of support and still win. Joe Biden won the state by 155,000 votes over Donald Trump, as opposed to around the 20,000 vote margin in the state of Wisconsin. Now, if you look at some of the trends here in the state of Michigan, what you're going to see is that Republicans are still going to overperform and do a bit better than what Donald Trump did in 2020 with some of the rural voters. The rural areas are not yet maxed out for the Republican Party in the state of Michigan. Now, the test of the state of Michigan will especially be how much of that Democratic support can someone like Kamala Harris hang on to in two different metrics. Firstly, how many of these more dissatisfied, disaffected Democrats will stick with the Democratic Party? We've seen a lot of Arab American-led protests as well as younger protesters around Washington County, around Wayne County, who are disaffected with Democrats in their handling of the Israel-Hamas crisis. Will Democrats be able to hang on to about 90% of those voters, or about 90% of them stay home and not vote at all in the presidential election? Now, I think that roughly about 60-70% of them will still turn out, but some of them will definitely stay home, and that would hurt Harris. Additionally, someone like Kamala Harris will probably not be able to do as well, again, with some of those white college-educated affluent voters in areas like Oakland County and Kent County. Oakland County generally reports one batch of votes pretty quickly, so on election night, do take a look for that. If someone like Kamala Harris is running even or better than Joe Biden's number, she's probably going to win the state. If not, the state will definitely be more competitive. Now, as of right now, I still give the state to a slight advantage here for Kamala Harris, just because Democrats have a larger buffer here, and the fact that Kamala Harris will probably do okay in some of these urban areas, unlike Joe Biden, who's really doing quite poorly with some of those urban younger voters, as well as some of these more racial minorities. Therefore, the state of Michigan right now in the tilt blue column. Now going to the state of Pennsylvania. Now, if you look at the state of Pennsylvania and its polling, again, the state has been very competitive, with Harris leading by just about 1%. This is down from about a 2% margin of victory here for Kamala Harris before RFK Jr. decided to drop out. Now, unlike some of the other competitive states, RFK dropping out here has certainly benefited Donald Trump in the polling, at least marginally. As you can see, some of the more recent polls actually do have Trump ahead by a slight margin or have it as even. And again, polling in some of these Rust Belt states, as well as across the nation, but in particular with states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, have historically underestimated Donald Trump. As a result, this should be a good sign for Donald Trump and his chances of winning the state back in 2024. Now, what the state's going to come down to is the fact that, again, Trump will do very well in the rural areas, but these areas are kind of maxed out for him, and I think Kamala Harris will still do pretty well in the urban areas. What's going to come down to is how much support does Democrats lose in some of these more, white working class areas, specifically in like Lehigh County, Northampton County, Monroe County, Lackawanna County, Erie County, Pike County, as well as Bucks County, which is the least affluent out of the 4 suburban counties around Philadelphia. Now, it's indisputable, in my opinion, that Democrats will lose some of that support in those areas, but they're probably still going to win most of these counties like Lehigh County, like Monroe County. Now, one of the good indicators on election night will be whether Democrats are able to hold Erie County. If someone like Kamala Harris does hold Erie County, she'll probably win the state. However, I think it's highly unlikely that will happen because, again, she's not that good with some of these more white working class type of voters, as well as some of these white working class voters here. Additionally, Democrats have been losing support in Philadelphia by pretty gradual sums, where we saw in 2016, for instance, someone like, I believe Hillary Clinton won the county by roughly, 67-68%, while Joe Biden won this county by about 64-65%. While 3.5% drop-off may seem marginal in a county with 735,000 voters, that's certainly a significant drop-off. That's about 25,000 votes that Joe Biden lost in this one county alone. Considering the fact that he only won the state by roughly 75,000 votes, that's pretty significant. Add that onto the fact that Democratic turnout will probably be lower in some of the urban areas because, again, 2020 was a very high turnout election because a lot of these Democratic voters or moderate voters were simply voting to oppose Donald Trump. They weren't really too there to vote for Democrats. And where Donald Trump is not in office, that could be a problem for Democrats because the simple anti-Trump argument probably isn't enough to motivate these voters. By contrast, some of these Donald Trump voters, they're pretty diehard supporters for him, and they're going to turn out regardless. So that turnout gap is definitely going to end up benefiting someone like Donald Trump over someone like Kamala Harris. And the fact is, the state is still very competitive. It only voted for Joe Biden by 1.2%. Even though the state was actually Joe Biden's home state, you can just see the fact that Democrats do have a pretty tough hill to climb in the state of Pennsylvania. So right now, I do have Pennsylvania here in the tilt Republican column. Now, in summary, this election is still very competitive, where I think this election hinges on about really 4 states: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. All 4 of these states I expect to be decided by 2% or less. Wisconsin, I think, is a pretty good state for Donald Trump. I think Michigan does tilt towards Harris, while Pennsylvania and Arizona currently does tilt towards Donald Trump. Now, Trump does need to hold both, not both, but either the state of Arizona or the state of Pennsylvania. If those states do go to Kamala Harris, then Kamala Harris wins the 2024 presidential election. Similarly, she could rotate the state of Wisconsin for the state of Arizona. Now, this election is still definitely very competitive, but I do think that Donald Trump does have the edge in this election, just because of the fact that Joe Biden still is not very popular, and you hardly see an incumbent party with such a low approval rating to end up winning the general election. Additionally, Kamala Harris is not this type of once-in-a-generational candidate, while Donald Trump is certainly able to energize his base and turn out a lot of these voters, and I still believe that he is still slightly favored to win, especially considering although many people say that the polling is favorable for Democrats, it's still not closer to 2016 or 2020 levels, and in 2016, where polling was really favorable for Clinton, she still ended up losing. So in my opinion right now, Donald Trump is still narrowly favored by about a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 ratio, but nonetheless here Kamala Harris still has a chance to win the presidency. Anyways, thank you for watching today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. 98.5% of you are currently unsubscribed, so be sure to subscribe, like this video, share it with your friends. Thank you so much for watching. Post down your own predictions for this election, and goodbye.